My daughters had me committed to a psychiatric facility for paranoid delusions because I insisted that someone was stealing from my pension fund and monitoring my activities. 3 months later, federal investigators confirmed that I had uncovered the largest corporate embezzlement scheme in our state's history, worth over $200 million. But let me start from the moment when my careful attention to financial irregularities was dismissed as evidence of mental illness rather than evidence of criminal activity that needed investigation. It was a Thursday morning in early March when I first noticed the discrepancy in my pension statement. I had been receiving monthly distributions from Meridian Financial Services for 8 years since my retirement from the school district, and I had developed the habit of carefully reviewing every document, every calculation, every line item that affected my financial security. The difference was small, $107 less than the previous month's payment, but it wasn't explained by any of the usual variables like tax withholdings, fee adjustments, or market fluctuations that typically caused minor variations in retirement distributions. I called Meridian's customer service line and spoke with a representative who assured me that the reduction was due to portfolio rebalancing and administrative cost adjustments that were standard practices in pension fund management. But something about her explanation didn't align with the documents I had been maintaining. I had been tracking my account balance, my monthly distributions, and the performance of my pension investments for nearly a decade, and the patterns I was seeing didn't match the explanations I was receiving. That's when I started keeping more detailed records. I began documenting every phone call, every statement, every communication from Meridian Financial. I started researching pension fund regulations, investment performance benchmarks, and fiduciary responsibilities of financial management companies. I developed spreadsheets that tracked discrepancies between what I was told and what appeared in my account statements. "Mom," my daughter Jennifer said when she visited the following month and found me working at my dining room table surrounded by financial documents, calculators, and notebooks filled with dates, times, and detailed observations. "What is all this?" "I'm tracking irregularities in my pension payments," I said, showing her the spreadsheets and documentation I had been maintaining. "I think someone at Meridian Financial is stealing money from retirement accounts." Jennifer looked at my work with the expression of someone encountering evidence of behavior that worried her. "Mom, this looks obsessive. Are you sure these aren't just normal variations in your pension payments?" "Jennifer, these aren't normal variations. Look at this pattern," I said, pointing to data that showed systematic reductions in payments that didn't correspond to any legitimate financial adjustments. "But Mom, wouldn't the company notice if someone was stealing? Wouldn't there be oversight, audits, regulatory supervision?" "That's exactly what I'm trying to understand," I said. "But the more I research, the more I think the oversight systems aren't working the way they're supposed to." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, studying my documentation with growing concern. "Mom, have you been experiencing any other unusual thoughts or concerns lately?" Unusual thoughts or concerns. The phrase that families use when they're beginning to question someone's mental state, when they're starting to interpret focused attention and systematic investigation as evidence of psychological problems. "Jennifer, what do you mean by unusual?" "I mean, are you worried about other things? Do you feel like people are watching you or that there might be other conspiracies or problems that you need to investigate?" "Other conspiracies." She was asking whether my concerns about pension fraud were part of a larger pattern of paranoid thinking, whether my systematic documentation was evidence of mental illness rather than evidence of potential criminal activity. "Jennifer, I'm worried about financial fraud that could be affecting thousands of retirees. I'm not worried about conspiracies. I'm worried about crimes." But I could see in her expression that she was interpreting my focused attention on financial irregularities as concerning behavior that might require professional assessment. 2 weeks later, Jennifer and my other daughter Patricia arrived at my house together, carrying folders and wearing the synchronized expressions of people who had been planning a difficult conversation. "Mom," Patricia said, "we need to talk to you about something important." Something important. The phrase that had become the preface to every family intervention in my recent experience. Every conversation where my daughters had decided that my behavior required their management rather than their support. "We've made an appointment for you with Dr. Harrison, a psychiatrist who specializes in late-onset mental health issues," Jennifer said, producing papers from her folder. "We're concerned about your fixation on this pension situation, and we think you might be developing some paranoid thinking patterns that could be treated." Paranoid thinking patterns. They had diagnosed my investigation of financial irregularities as evidence of mental illness, and they had scheduled psychiatric intervention without consulting me about whether I thought there was a problem that needed medical attention. That appointment with Dr. Harrison would become the beginning of a process that would end with my involuntary commitment to a psychiatric facility, all because my daughters couldn't distinguish between paranoid delusions and accurate observations of criminal activity. Dr. Harrison was a soft-spoken man in his 60s, who approached our initial consultation with what seemed like genuine interest in understanding my concerns about financial irregularities, though I could sense that he was evaluating my responses for signs of delusional thinking rather than assessing the validity of my observations. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, settling into his office chair with a notepad and the kind of careful attention that psychiatrists use when they're trying to determine whether someone's beliefs are grounded in reality. "Your daughters have shared their concerns about your recent focus on pension fund issues. Can you tell me about what you've been discovering?" I had prepared for this conversation by organizing my documentation into clear, logical presentations that would demonstrate the systematic nature of my investigation and the evidence-based conclusions I had reached. "Dr. Harrison, I've been tracking discrepancies between my expected pension payments and my actual distributions for 6 months. The patterns I've identified suggest systematic theft from retirement accounts managed by Meridian Financial Services." I showed him my spreadsheets, my correspondence with customer service representatives, and my research into pension fund regulations that appeared to be violated by practices I had documented. "These discrepancies," I continued, "aren't random variations or market fluctuations. They're consistent reductions that suggest deliberate embezzlement of funds that belong to retirees." Dr. Harrison was taking notes, but I could see him evaluating my presentation through the lens of psychiatric assessment rather than fraud investigation. "Mrs. Rodriguez, what evidence do you have that these discrepancies represent intentional theft rather than legitimate administrative adjustments or market-based variations?" "Dr. Harrison, I've been tracking the performance of the underlying investments that are supposed to be generating my pension payments. The market performance doesn't correlate with the reductions in my distributions. Someone is skimming money from accounts and using market volatility as cover for their theft." "And how have you been gathering information about underlying investment performance?" "Through financial databases, SEC filings, and market research that I've been conducting independently." Dr. Harrison made a note that I suspected related to my obsessive research behavior rather than my investigative methodology. "Mrs. Rodriguez, your daughters mentioned that you've also expressed concerns about surveillance, about people monitoring your activities. Can you tell me about those concerns?" This was the question I had been expecting. The point where my accurate observations about being watched would be interpreted as paranoid delusions rather than logical responses to actual surveillance. "Dr. Harrison, I've noticed vehicles parked outside my house for extended periods, people taking photographs of my property, and interruptions in my phone service that suggest my communications are being monitored. And what do you think is the connection between these surveillance activities and your concerns about pension fraud?" I think that my investigation of financial irregularities has attracted attention from people who have something to hide. I think that criminal organizations don't like being investigated, even by individual retirees. Dr. Harrison was quiet for a moment, processing my explanation and what I assumed was his assessment of whether my beliefs represented logical deductions from observed evidence or paranoid interpretations of coincidental events. "Mrs. Rodriguez, has anyone else confirmed these observations about surveillance? Have you reported these concerns to law enforcement?" "I've attempted to contact regulatory agencies, but I haven't received responses that suggest they're taking my concerns seriously. And Dr. Harrison, when you're alleging financial crimes worth millions of dollars, you learn to be careful about who you trust with information. So you haven't shared your evidence with police, FBI, or financial regulatory agencies?" "I've sent preliminary reports to the SEC and the State Insurance Commissioner, but I haven't received acknowledgments or responses that indicate they're investigating." What I didn't tell Dr. Harrison was that I had also been documenting the surveillance activities, photographing vehicles and license plates, and maintaining detailed logs of suspicious activities around my property. I had learned to be cautious about revealing the full extent of my investigation to people whose motives I couldn't be certain about. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I'd like to schedule some follow-up sessions to continue discussing these concerns. In the meantime, I'm going to recommend some medication that might help with anxiety and sleep issues that often accompany stressful situations." Anxiety and sleep issues. He was treating my investigation of financial crimes as a stress disorder, rather than as legitimate whistleblowing that might require legal and regulatory support. But what Dr. Harrison didn't know, and what my daughters hadn't considered, was that my paranoid delusions were about to be validated by federal investigators who had been conducting their own investigation of Meridian Financial Services and who were very interested in the evidence I had been collecting. 6 weeks after my initial evaluation with Dr. Harrison, my psychiatric consultations had escalated to a point where my daughters, with Dr. Harrison's support, petitioned for my involuntary commitment to Ridge Valley Psychiatric Hospital for what they described as treatment of paranoid delusions and obsessive behavior that posed a risk to my own well-being. The commitment hearing was brief and procedural. Dr. Harrison testified that I exhibited systematic paranoid thinking, obsessive documentation of imaginary conspiracies, and persistent beliefs in surveillance activities that had no basis in reality. My daughters provided testimony about my fixation on pension fraud and my social isolation, as I had become increasingly focused on my investigation. Your Honor, Patricia said during her testimony, our mother has become completely consumed by these theories about financial crimes and surveillance. She's filling notebooks with observations about cars parked on her street, taking photographs of strangers, and spending hours every day researching conspiracy theories on the internet. Conspiracy theories. They were characterizing my financial analysis and fraud investigation as internet-based conspiracy research, my documentation of actual surveillance as paranoid observation of normal activities. She's not eating regularly, she's not sleeping well, and she's becoming isolated from friends and family because she's convinced that people are trying to harm her, Jennifer added. The court-appointed psychiatric evaluator who had spent 30 minutes reviewing my case concluded that involuntary commitment was appropriate for stabilization and treatment of acute paranoid ideation. I was admitted to Ridge Valley on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, processed through intake procedures designed for people experiencing mental health crises, and assigned to a unit that specialized in treating elderly patients with late-onset psychiatric conditions. Mrs. Rodriguez, said the attending psychiatrist, Dr. Martinez, during my intake interview, I understand you've been experiencing some distressing thoughts about financial fraud and surveillance. We're here to help you work through these concerns and develop coping strategies that will improve your quality of life. Distressing thoughts about financial fraud. Dr. Martinez was approaching my investigation of actual crimes as symptoms of mental illness that needed therapeutic intervention rather than evidence of criminal activity that needed law enforcement investigation. Dr. Martinez, what I've been experiencing isn't distressing thoughts. What I've been experiencing is the discovery of systematic embezzlement from pension funds that affects thousands of retirees. Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand that these concerns feel very real to you, and that's exactly what makes them so distressing. Part of our treatment approach will be helping you distinguish between realistic concerns and concerns that might be influenced by anxiety, depression, or other mental health factors. Realistic concerns versus concerns influenced by mental health factors. He was treating my accurate observations as symptoms rather than as information that might require verification through investigation. The treatment plan that Dr. Martinez developed included antipsychotic medication to reduce paranoid ideation, therapy sessions to address obsessive thinking patterns, and reality orientation activities designed to help me reconnect with factual information rather than conspiracy-based beliefs. But what Dr. Martinez and my daughters didn't know was that while I was being treated for paranoid delusions, federal investigators were following up on the preliminary reports I had filed with regulatory agencies before my commitment. 3 weeks into my hospitalization, a patient advocate approached me with news that would change everything about how my family understood my mental health status in my investigation of financial crimes. Mrs. Rodriguez, you have visitors from the FBI who are here to discuss some financial documents that you apparently submitted to federal agencies before your hospitalization. FBI visitors, at a psychiatric hospital, to discuss financial documents that my family and my doctors had dismissed as products of paranoid delusions. What was about to happen would prove that sometimes what looks like mental illness to people who don't understand complex situations is actually accurate investigation of criminal activity that requires law enforcement attention rather than psychiatric treatment. Special Agent Rebecca Chin and Agent Michael Torres from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division arrived at Ridge Valley Psychiatric Hospital on a Wednesday afternoon, carrying briefcases and credentials that immediately transformed my status from psychiatric patient to potential federal witness. Mrs. Rodriguez, Agent Chen said as we settled into the hospital's family consultation room. "We're here because your reports to the SEC and the State Insurance Commissioner triggered a federal investigation that has uncovered significant evidence of embezzlement and fraud at Meridian Financial Services." Federal investigation. The reports that my daughters had dismissed as evidence of paranoid delusions had actually initiated legitimate law enforcement investigation of the crimes I had been documenting. "Agent Chen, I've been hospitalized for psychiatric treatment because my family believes I'm experiencing paranoid thoughts about financial fraud." "Mrs. Rodriguez, we're here because your paranoid thoughts appear to be accurate observations of criminal activity. The evidence you compiled before your hospitalization has been crucial in our investigation." Agent Torres opened his briefcase and produced documents that I recognized as copies of the reports, spreadsheets, and correspondence that I had sent to regulatory agencies during my months of investigation. "Mrs. Rodriguez, your documentation of payment discrepancies, your analysis of investment performance, and your identification of regulatory violations provided the foundation for a federal investigation that has now expanded to include 12 states and over $200 million in stolen retirement funds." $200 million. The scope of the fraud I had uncovered was far larger than I had initially estimated, affecting thousands of retirees across multiple states. "Agent Chen, what exactly did your investigation discover?" "We discovered that Meridian Financial Services has been systematically embezzling from pension and retirement accounts for over 7 years. The scheme involved creating artificial administrative fees, reporting false investment performance, and redirecting retirement payments to accounts controlled by company executives." "And the surveillance activities I reported?" "Mrs. Rodriguez, when you began investigating payment discrepancies and filing complaints with regulatory agencies, Meridian hired private investigators to monitor your activities and assess whether you posed a threat to their operation." Agent Torres was reviewing notes from their investigation. "The license plates you photographed, the vehicles you documented, the communication interruptions you experienced, all of these were part of surveillance activities designed to monitor your investigation and potentially intimidate you into discontinuing your research." "So I wasn't experiencing paranoid delusions?" "Mrs. Rodriguez, you were experiencing criminal surveillance by people who were trying to protect a $200 million fraud scheme. Your observations were accurate, your documentation was thorough, and your conclusions were correct." Agent Chen was looking through my hospital file, which had been provided by Dr. Martinez for their consultation. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we need to discuss your current legal status and your potential testimony in federal criminal proceedings. But first, we need to address the issue of your psychiatric commitment." "What do you mean?" "We need to request your immediate discharge from this facility so that you can serve as a witness in federal fraud proceedings. We'll be recommending to the court that your commitment was based on misdiagnosed investigative activity rather than genuine psychiatric symptoms." Agent Torres was reviewing the criminal case they were building against Meridian Financial Services. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we've identified 18 individuals who will be facing federal charges related to this embezzlement scheme. Your investigation provided the initial evidence that made their prosecution possible. What happens now?" "Now we coordinate with your doctors, your family, and the court system to secure your discharge from psychiatric treatment so that you can participate in criminal proceedings against the people who were stealing from your pension fund." The conversation that followed with Dr. Martinez was unlike any psychiatric consultation in the history of Ridge Valley Hospital. Instead of discussing treatment for paranoid delusions, we were discussing the hospital's liability for committing a federal witness whose symptoms had turned out to be accurate crime reporting. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Dr. Martinez said after meeting with the FBI agents, "I owe you a significant apology. What we treated as psychiatric symptoms were actually legitimate observations of criminal activity. But the real apology would have to come from my daughters, who were about to learn that their mother's paranoid delusions had uncovered the largest financial fraud scheme in their state's history." The meeting with Jennifer and Patricia took place in Ridge Valley Hospital's family conference room 3 days after the FBI visit, with Dr. Martinez, the hospital's legal counsel, and Agent Chen present to explain how my psychiatric commitment had interfered with a federal criminal investigation. "Jennifer, Patricia," Agent Chen began, "your mother was not experiencing paranoid delusions when she reported concerns about financial fraud and surveillance activities. She was conducting a legitimate investigation of criminal activity that has resulted in federal charges against 18 individuals for embezzling over $200 million from retirement accounts. My daughters were staring at Agent Chen with expressions of complete confusion and growing embarrassment. "I don't understand," Jennifer said. "Mom was obsessed with conspiracy theories about people stealing from her pension fund." "Jennifer," Agent Chen replied, "people were stealing from her pension fund, and from thousands of other retirees. Your mother's obsession with tracking financial discrepancies uncovered one of the largest embezzlement schemes in federal law enforcement history." Dr. Martinez was reviewing the psychiatric evaluations and treatment plans that had been based on the assumption that my concerns about financial fraud were symptoms of mental illness. "Patricia, Jennifer, I need to explain something about psychiatric evaluation and diagnosis. When your mother reported systematic surveillance activities and complex financial conspiracies, we evaluated those reports as potential symptoms of paranoid thinking. What we failed to do was verify whether her observations might be accurate." "But the surveillance," Patricia said, "the people watching her house, the phone interruptions, those sounded like classic paranoid delusions." "Those were classic surveillance activities conducted by private investigators hired by Meridian Financial Services to monitor your mother's investigation of their embezzlement scheme," Agent Chen explained. Agent Torres opened his laptop and showed them photographs that I had taken of vehicles and license plates during my months of being watched. These vehicles were registered to Hartley Investigations, a private security firm that Meridian Financial contracted to conduct surveillance on approximately 40 retirees who had filed complaints about payment discrepancies. Jennifer was staring at the photographs with recognition. "Mom showed us these pictures. We thought she was imagining things. She was documenting things, very accurately." Dr. Martinez was reviewing my hospital treatment records. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I need to discuss the medication and therapy interventions we've been providing. Since your concerns about fraud and surveillance were based on accurate observations rather than psychiatric symptoms, we need to reassess your treatment plan completely." "Dr. Martinez, what I need is discharge from psychiatric treatment so I can testify in federal criminal proceedings." "Mrs. Rodriguez, based on the FBI's findings and our reassessment of your mental health status, I'm recommending your immediate discharge. You were never experiencing the psychiatric symptoms we were treating." Patricia was processing this information with what appeared to be genuine distress about the implications. "So when we had Mom committed for psychiatric treatment, we were actually interfering with her investigation of crimes that were really happening. Patricia, you were trying to protect your mother from what you thought were distressing delusions. Unfortunately, what you were actually protecting were the criminals who were stealing from her pension account." "Agent Chen," Jennifer asked, "what happens to Mom now?" "Now your mother becomes a key witness in federal criminal proceedings. She'll be working with prosecutors to ensure that the people who stole from her retirement fund and the retirement funds of thousands of other seniors are held accountable for their crimes." The conversation that followed with my daughters was perhaps the most difficult family discussion of my life. Not because they had been wrong about my mental health, but because their mistake had been based on assumptions about my capabilities rather than curiosity about my observations. "Mom," Jennifer said, "I need to apologize for not believing you when you said someone was stealing from your pension. And I need to apologize for not taking your investigation seriously. When you showed us your research and documentation," Patricia added, "girls, you thought you were protecting me from distressing delusions. I understand that. But Mom, we should have listened to you. We should have helped you investigate instead of assuming you were getting sick. What you should have done," I said, "is trusted that your mother might be capable of recognizing and investigating financial crimes, even at my age." 6 months later, I would testify before a federal grand jury that indicted 18 individuals for their roles in the Meridian financial embezzlement scheme. My documentation and investigative work were described by federal prosecutors as exemplary citizen reporting that had made their case possible. But the real victory wasn't in the criminal convictions or the recovery of stolen pension funds. It was in my daughter's recognition that competence and investigative ability don't automatically decline with age, and that systematic attention to financial irregularities might represent expertise rather than mental illness. 1 year after my discharge from Ridge Valley Psychiatric Hospital, I was standing in the federal courthouse in downtown Portland, watching as the last of the Meridian financial executives received their sentences for their roles in the $20-37 million pension fraud scheme that I had uncovered through careful attention to discrepancies in my monthly retirement payments. Marcus Sullivan, the CEO of Meridian Financial Services, received a sentence of 22 years in federal prison for orchestrating the embezzlement operation that had stolen from over 8,000 retirees across 14 states. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 8 to 18 years, along with restitution orders that would recover most of the stolen funds for affected pension accounts. Mrs. Rodriguez, said federal prosecutor Janet Walsh after the final sentencing hearing, "I want you to understand that without your initial investigation and the documentation you provided to regulatory agencies, we might never have discovered this fraud scheme. The investigation that my family had treated as evidence of paranoid delusions had become the foundation for the largest pension fraud prosecution in federal history. Your systematic tracking of payment discrepancies, your analysis of investment performance, and your documentation of surveillance activities provided crucial evidence that made these convictions possible. During the year between my hospital discharge and the final criminal sentences, I had worked closely with federal investigators, testified before multiple grand juries, and provided evidence that helped prosecutors understand the complex methods that Meridian Financial had used to steal from retirees. But more importantly, I had become an advocate for other seniors who had been victims of financial fraud, working with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division to develop educational programs that taught retirees how to recognize and report suspicious activities in their pension and investment accounts. Mrs. Rodriguez, Agent Chen said during one of our final case consultations, "We'd like to offer you a position as a consultant with the FBI's Senior Financial Crimes Task Force. Your investigative skills and your understanding of how these fraud schemes operate would be valuable in training other agents and educating potential victims." A consultant position with the FBI. At age 73, I was being offered professional employment in law enforcement based on investigative skills that my family had treated as symptoms of mental illness. Agent Chen, "I'd be very interested in that position. The work would involve reviewing cases, training agents, and developing educational materials for seniors who might be targeted by financial fraud schemes." 6 months later, I was featured in a joint press release from the FBI and the National Association of Insurance Commissioners announcing the launch of the Senior Financial Protection Initiative, a program designed to help elderly Americans recognize and report financial crimes targeting retirement accounts. Betty Rodriguez, the press release stated, "demonstrates that some of our most effective fraud detection comes from alert seniors who pay careful attention to their financial accounts and who have the persistence to pursue investigation even when their concerns are initially dismissed." The program I developed with federal investigators helped identify over 40 additional cases of retirement fraud, leading to prosecutions that recovered more than $50 million in stolen funds for affected retirees. But the recognition that meant the most came from my daughters, who had attended every day of the criminal trials and who had watched their mother testify as the key witness in federal fraud prosecutions. "Mom," Jennifer said after the final sentencing hearing, "I need to tell you something I should have said a year ago." "What's that?" "When you were trying to explain your investigation to us, when you were showing us your research and your documentation, we should have listened. We should have helped you instead of assuming you were getting sick. Jennifer, you thought you were protecting me from distressing delusions. But Mom, what we were actually doing was protecting criminals from someone who was smart enough and persistent enough to catch them." Patricia, who had been quiet during most of the trial proceedings, spoke up. "Mom, I've been thinking about something. When we had you committed for psychiatric treatment, we assumed that your age meant you couldn't be conducting sophisticated investigations of complex crimes. And now I realize that your age and your experience were exactly what made you effective at recognizing patterns that younger people might have missed." The FBI position that I accepted allowed me to work on financial crimes cases for 4 more years, until I retired for the second time at age 77, with commendations from federal law enforcement and recognition from victims' advocacy organizations. But the real measure of success wasn't in the criminal convictions or the professional recognition. It was in the knowledge that when I had observed financial irregularities and surveillance activities, I had trusted my own observations rather than accepting other people's assessments of my mental health. My daughters had me committed to a psychiatric facility for paranoid delusions, because I insisted that someone was stealing from my pension fund and monitoring my activities. 3 months later, federal investigators confirmed that I had uncovered the largest corporate embezzlement scheme in our state's history. Sometimes what looks like mental illness to people who don't understand complex situations is actually accurate investigation of criminal activity that requires law enforcement support, rather than psychiatric treatment. If you've ever been told that your concerns are unfounded, your observations are imaginary, or your investigations are evidence of mental health problems, remember that competence and investigative ability don't decline automatically with age. This was my truth, and it began with paying careful attention to discrepancies that other people dismissed as unimportant, because sometimes the most important crimes are discovered by people who notice when small details don't add up correctly.